Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Power Parsha Pearls. This week, we read the portion of Vayechi, which is the ultimate portion, the end of the book of Genesis, bringing the whole story of Joseph, his family, to a culmination of Jacob coming down, settling in the land of Egypt, and the whole family being reunited once more. You know, I've often wondered about the significance of the Torah portion, beginning with telling us that Jacob lived in the land of Egypt. It's a detail that is self-evident when you follow earlier and later accounts of the story. So why does it have to tell us what is otherwise the obvious? And the explanation lies in the fact that the Torah, when it wants to talk about settling in the land, typically uses the Hebrew word Vayechi, and he settled, as we find an earlier Torah portion, so-called Vayechi, because Jacob then settled in the land of Israel. But in this particular instance, the Torah uses a very deliberate term. It doesn't tell us and he settled. It actually tells us and he lived in the land of Egypt. The significance of telling us this comes to communicate something far more detailed and far more profound. And that is simply the fact that, like the word chai, vayechi, it wasn't just living, it was enthusiasm. Not just living, but liveliness. Jacob spent his twilight era, the final 17 years of his life, with all his family around him. He was, it would seem, in the words of the commentaries, living the best years of his life. And yet you have to wonder, there was an earlier tranquil period before the sale of Joseph when he had all his family around him as well. The first 17 years of Joseph's life. What makes these final years more meaningful such that the Torah has to highlight them with the term Vayechi, and he lived? Several years ago, over the winter holiday period, I spent a long weekend in Amsterdam with a group of some 600 Jewish students from across Europe, other parts of the world. And being in Holland gave me an opportunity to take my own children back to roots, to where my parents came from. My mother was born there. She endured the war years there. My father and his family moved there from Switzerland after the war. And I took my kids to the Anne Frank house, which I know made quite an impression on them. But notwithstanding the whole exceptional experience that impacted them, there was something particular at the end of the experience that really struck home. Before you leave the Anne Frank house, there is a large room in which one sits and watches short film clips. And you're asked questions and you're instructed to push either the red or the green button nearest to you to vote on the answer. The side screen will then give you the percentages of those in the room, as well as how that compares with past audience averages. So for example, you'll see a scene of a flag burning with some commentary, and the question on the screen asks, do you think flag burning should be outlawed? 42% yes, in the room that is, 58% no. Past audience average, 47% yes, 53% no. Then there was another particular question that was asked, and that was a scene of a group of neo-Nazis marching past a synagogue in Berlin as part of an annual event, chanting their slogans of hatred under careful police scrutiny. The question that followed is not whether they should be allowed to march altogether. It was simply whether they should be allowed to parade their vile selves in front of a synagogue. 83% no, 17% yes. That meant that to mine and my children's shock horror, we are sitting in a room in the Anne Frank house with people who will have just spent the last hour and a half reading, watching, listening, and still maintaining a heart of hatred, agreeing that it should be okay to march past the synagogue with your Nazi flags and whatever else besides. Does the experience not move them? I mean, have they no conscience and iota of decency and humanity within? And adding insult to injury, past audience average for that question, 74% no, 26% yes. Anti-Semitism is alive and well, even if only a minority. It always starts as a minority. Now, against that backdrop and with that pain just gnawing at me, I addressed the students on a Friday night. I climbed up on a table after a few l'chaims, and I proceeded to tell them how a mere several decades prior, my grandparents were in hiding in a loft for more than 2 years, not all that far from where we were. And each and every Friday afternoon, whilst in hiding, my grandmother would insist my grandfather should put on his tie for Shabbat, a small gesture for man in that tiny loft, a gigantic gesture for Jewish mankind and the sake of Shabbat. I told him how all during that time, my mother was taken in by a Dutch priest and hidden for 2.5 years. I told him how the priest himself had risked his life to come all the way down once in the cold of winter to meet with my grandfather for all of 3 hours at great risk to his own life, just to reassure him that each night he reminds my mother that she is a Jewish girl. And how on the night this priest died, several years after the war, my father eulogized him on Kol Nidre at Yom Kippur. And then I stated the obvious, but something which we don't always immediately see. I said to them at that time, 75 years ago, they tried to obliterate every remnant of Judaism from the face of this country and beyond. And here we sit, I said, all these years on, rejoicing and celebrating Shabbat together. We are living proof that Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people, are not just living, they're Chai. Vayechi Yaakov, they're thriving. They're lively, despite the persecution, despite the suffering, despite all the very threats to assimilation. You see, the biggest threat to Jacob's integrity and honorable family name is that maybe his son Joseph, now empowered in Egypt, captain of industry, would have assimilated into his culture. He was second in command. You don't get much bigger than that. Jacob is the prototype of the Jew in exile. He's looking ahead. He knows that this is just the beginning, was going to be a long and painful exile that his own offspring are going to endure. And he knows that this is also the forerunner of other exiles that will emerge in the due course of time. Will we Jewish people be able to survive? Not indeed just survive, but thrive. And the reality is that it would only make sense that Joseph should go with the flow, that he should blend in as, if you will, the only Jew in the whole of Egypt. But Judaism never quite goes with the flow. It never looks to make sense. It transcends rationale. When Jacob comes to Egypt and he encounters his son and his grandchildren living and thriving as loud and proud Jews, Vayechi Yaakov, he doesn't just settle there, he lives. These are the best years of his life. Jewish continuity is guaranteed. And you know, on that weekend in Amsterdam, when I went downstairs on Sunday evening to check out the big New Year's bash that was going on in the ballroom, I realized that at least there's so much more of a chance that so many of them there will marry Jewish. And seeing that scene a mere several decades on, I understood Jacob's feelings, and that indeed, Vayechi, Am Yisrael Chai. But then there's something else to consider. Have you ever wondered why the Torah relays the story of Joseph in so much detail? No less than 4 portions are dedicated to the story of his life, his adventures, his desperate downs, and his ultimate ups. Obviously, it's not just to capture our imagination. No story is without a moral, and within this tale, there were important lessons as well. One profound lesson I suggest we can derive from the saga is what I would describe as the 3 lets for life. Let it go, let it out, let it happen. Let's consider. Joseph's brothers sell him to Egypt. Eventually, he emerges as viceroy in the land. The brothers come down to buy food. All sorts of exchanges and interactions transpire between them. At a certain point, Joseph insists that Benjamin comes down to Egypt as well. And when planting his goblet in Benjamin's bag, he thereafter insists on keeping him as prisoner. Judah steps up to the plate and he challenges what he deems the injustice of Joseph's attitude towards him and his brothers. He rages against him. He threatens violence. And then everything suddenly goes calm. And they relax. And when they go calm, that's when Joseph can no longer contain himself and he discloses his identity to his brothers. King Solomon says in Proverbs, responding softly calms anger, and a harsh word triggers rage. Do you know how frustrating it is for someone who's yelling at you, for you to respond to them in a just very calm and collected manner? They become completely disoriented. They become diffused. They're yelling like, and you say, no, I hear your point. Wait, what? Conversely, when you yell back, then no one hears, no one listens. And when you fight fire with fire, then you're left with ashes. What is it they say after the first year of marriage? The husband talks and the wife listens. After the second year, the wife talks and the husband listens. After the third year, they're both talking and the neighbors listen. When you lose your cool, you're no longer thinking. You're just reacting. You can't think rationally because your rage is occupying so much of your headspace and your brain is processing everything so super fast to protect you from that which is threatening you. And it is precisely in those moments that things are said or done, which can often not be undone or unsaid. Judah takes a step back in this confrontation with Joseph to assess the situation. He takes that proverbial deep breath and the first let. He lets it go. The anger dissipates. His mind is calm. He speaks softly, and that's what draws Joseph out. What would have become a showdown of disastrous proportions is now neutralized. People bear grudges. If there's one Yiddish word that every Jew knows and many non-Jews know, it's broigus. It sits, it festers, it eats away. And yet all during the while, like a hot coal, it's the one holding on to the grudge that gets burnt. You don't get punished for your anger, but you do get punished by your anger. Judah teaches us when you have that pent-up rage, assess the situation, put it in perspective, and then let it go. That's the first let for life. Second, why does Joseph spend so much time taunting his brothers? Why does he accuse them first as being spies, then insisting Benjamin be brought to Egypt, putting him through his ordeal before revealing his identity? What we need to understand is Joseph is not taunting his brothers for the sake of it. He's dealing with a lot of indignation. He's been deprived of his youth, for goodness sakes. He spent time in jail for a crime he didn't commit. Even his newfound glory and fame comes with incredible responsibility that must surely leave him feeling overwhelmed. There's a lot of aggression building up and he needs to let it out. The second let it out. Sometimes no matter what anyone says or what's going on, you just need to let it out. You need to scream, you need to cry, you need to howl. What does the verse tell us? Joseph demanded everybody leave, and then he let out a cry which was heard by Egypt and the whole household of Pharaoh. In other words, he yelled so loud that it penetrated throughout. So much pent up negativity. Everybody needs a moment to vent. Sometimes life just gets too much. Frequent inappropriate anger is bad, but the rare short freak out, if you will, is okay. Don't make it a habit. Don't take out your frustration on others. That never solves anything. But if every once in a while you need to just burst out and pound a pillow, go for it. Because when it's over, you've released so much energy. In relationships, parents, kids, husbands, wives, in the workplace, amongst friends, sometimes you have to let it out in context. Arguments are not just inevitable in every relationship. They are often necessary and vital for the stability of the relationship. And the test of a healthy relationship is not whether disagreements occur, but how the disagreements are conducted. We're all like soda cans. When you open it up, there's a little burst of air and noise, and then you're ready to drink, right? But what happens if you shake up the can over and over, throw it up and down and all around? When you open it, it explodes. You're a soda can. Is it better to let your feelings out right away or let them stay bouncing around inside you for a long time before they might spurt out, making a big mess? It really depends, doesn't it? The onus is on us individually to determine when to let it go and when to let it out. But finally, what about the cards that life deals us, the ones that are out of our control, that we can't do anything about? We just let it go, simply take it on the chin, shrug our shoulders in defeat? Or do we let it out? Do we rage against God and our fate, challenging why things happen? Where's the balance? How do we find the balance on that? When Joseph sent his brothers on their way, not once, but twice, he reiterates, "You did not send me here. God did so." Sure, it was Judah's idea to sell him down to Egypt. Yes, it was the brothers' hands that drew him from the pit. It was Reuben's negligence that let it all happen in the first place. And yet in the middle of all of that, Joseph recognizes the divine factor, the Bashert factor in all of this. We all play hands in our intertwined destiny, but ultimately it is God who deals the cards. We can cry out, like Moses did, "Why do you allow evil to befall your people?" But by the same token, there's an element of acceptance nonetheless. Sometimes you just have to let it happen. You can't turn back the clock. There are always going to be things that sit uncomfortably, questions that nag away. That's where we are challenged to be patient towards all that is unsolved in our hearts and try to live with the question themselves. In fact, don't seek the answers which cannot be given to you, because sometimes you wouldn't be able to live with them. It's a balance between being strong enough to accept that not every answer is available, but caring enough to still ask the questions. We have to be willing to let go of the life we have planned so as to accept the life that is waiting for us. If during the process you have to let it out as well, so be it. He understands. Just live everything, live the questions, let life happen to you. Along the way, you'll find your path and discover your destiny. So indeed, when we look at the story of Joseph and his brothers, it's not just a great tale which fires up the imagination of Andrew Lloyd Webber. Like every biblical tale that is related in intricate detail, it is because of the layers of inspiration that we can derive therefrom. So a worthwhile exercise for 2023. Learn to incorporate the 3 lets for life in our lives. Let it go when you have to, let it out when you must, and let it happen when you have to. You'll be happier and you'll lead a more enriching life in the process. Wish you all a Shabbat Shalom.